Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and get started now. Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Hask. I'm director of the Cornwall Library, and thank you so much for joining us for this program. Everyone who has joined will be muted throughout the program. We will be recording this program, so if you want to see it again or you want to tell a friend about it, it will be on the library's YouTube channel within a few days. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. So please put your questions into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. So I want to thank Anne and Roxana for joining us on this drizzly Sunday, a perfect day for a program like this. Anne E. Fernald is professor of English and Women's Studies at Fordham University. She's a scholar of modernism, especially Virginia Woolf. She edited Mrs. Dalloway for Cambridge University Press and is the editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Mrs. Dalloway, as well as the Oxford Handbook of Virginia Woolf. She's also the author of a book on Woolf, as well as articles and reviews on Woolf and feminist modernism. Roxana Robinson will be interviewing Anne. Roxana is an author and professor. She's written 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, and a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. She's written about Virginia Woolf for The New Yorker and other publications as well. She teaches in the MFA program at Hunter, and she has memorized To the Lighthouse. I think that's what she said. And thank you both very much for joining us. We're eager to get to what you have to say. If you're ready to get started, are we all set?
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that introduction. And my great thanks to my friend Anne for joining me in this conversation about Virginia Woolf.
It's great to see you, Roxana, and thank you, Margaret, for the lovely introduction. It's lovely to see so many people here wanting to talk about Woolf on a Sunday afternoon, so this is terrific.
So Anne and I have a long history of conversations about Virginia Woolf. And the way we first became in touch was that she wrote a review of one of my novels, and she commented on the fact that she could see a great deal of influence of Woolf's writing in my work. And it was something that I was very much aware of. It was my novel called Cost, and that I had been sort of channeling Woolf through another book, through Michael Cunningham's great book, The Hours. But I was very much drawing on Woolf's consciousness and her, the way she presented the world through her writing. And Anne was aware, and that there were moments in that book when I thought, am I going to be arrested for doing this? This is really blatant. The book has nothing to do with Woolf, and I don't plagiarize, but I could feel myself using her work very, very, very powerfully. So Anne wrote a review commenting on that, and we were put in contact, and then she's asked me to do things to do with Woolf. And then, and I've taken some classes that she gave at the Center for Fiction. And then she invited me, gave me the great honor of an invitation to write an essay for this new book of hers, the Oxford Handbook of Virginia Woolf, which I think was on the invitation. It's a very handsome edition. So what we're going to do is ask each other questions so we can have a real conversation instead of just a series of comments. And I will start first. And because everyone here is a Woolf fan, we all love Woolf, and we all have our stories. I have the first book of Woolf's I ever got, which I got in boarding school. And there's my name, Roxana Barry, To the Lighthouse. That was it's Mrs. Dalloway, my first encounter, and I remember it vividly. So, and we all have those stories, how we met Virginia Woolf's work and what it meant to us. So tell us your story about meeting her and her work.
Sure. So I love to tell this story because it's an unusual one, and it's fun to tell it on Zoom because I'm sitting with my grandmother's Woolf books. So especially these yellowed letters, are my grandmother's Woolf books. And my grandmother's very favorite writer in the world was Virginia Woolf. But I didn't like my grandmother. She's a mean person. She was really tough on me. She used to criticize me. I once showed her a short story that I wrote about mermaids that was heavily, heavily influenced by Hans Christian Andersen. I was about 7. And she showed me, she opened up her copy of Milton and showed me Milton's Juvenilia in Latin and Greek and suggested that my very derivative Hans Christian Andersen story could use some work, and that great poets, really did more than that. So, you can imagine with an exacting grandmother like that, I wasn't exactly in a hurry to read her favorite writer. But then I got to graduate school and I realized that you can't neglect a great woman writer or a great writer of any gender because of a personal family lore. So I read her for the very first time in a graduate course, and it was absolutely love at first sight. I just couldn't believe how great her sentences were. And it was the sentences that I fell in love with, not the stories. The poetic precision and care of how she writes about the experience of being a person and thinking in the world and having these thoughts really just drew me. And it was a funny class because it was Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein, and every week we read a little Woolf and a little Stein. And because of the particularities of being at Yale in the early 1990s, it was like a battle, and every week Stein won. And every week, because she was more experimental, she was weirder, she'd push language further. And every week I was like, well, Stein may have won, but the Woolf was better. It was more beautiful, and I nothing against Gertrude Stein. I mean, I think Gertrude Stein is a genius, but the Woolf just was like blowing my mind. So that's my origin story with Virginia Woolf.
It's such a great story, and that feeling of competitiveness is something we all know. I mean, the other competitive stories is Woolf, Proust, and Joyce. And because the three of them wrote this very early modernist stream of consciousness narrative, and Woolf herself did not like Joyce. She thought he was vulgar. She worshipped Proust, and she wrote, if only I could write like that, if only I could create this kind of immersion in experience that he does. And she really wrote about trying to be like Proust. What she does is something very different, but you have this sense of competing modernists and choosing yourself. I choose Woolf myself. I admire Joyce and Proust, but I think especially for a woman, as you say, and the sentences are inexpressibly beautiful. And they also deliver a kind of intimacy, an intimacy of experience for a woman that is unparalleled. I mean, we had nobody who was doing what she was doing, which is to say, this is what it's like to be alive, but also this is what it's like to be alive and to be a woman. And all the wonderful male writers that we loved and admired and cherished didn't think about what it was like to be a woman. And it's totally different. And Woolf accepted that and not celebrated it, but laid it out there. And it was so refreshing. It was like these big gulps of fresh air. Somebody is saying this out loud. I'm not allowed to walk on the lawn. I'm not allowed in the library. Someone is saying that that's not okay. All this patriarchal stuff, which in the 70s became very popular in the 1970s, she was saying in the 20s, and no one else was saying it. And no one was saying it in fiction. It was like standing under a waterfall.
Absolutely. So you were taught Woolf in high school.
Yeah, we had a great English teacher, and we read Mrs. Dalloway. And like you, it just I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could set down sentences of such beauty, and we were encouraged to read for the beauty of the language, but also it was a girls' boarding school, and so we were allowed to think in these terms and to recognize the fact that the experience of life is different for a woman than it is for a man. So it was very liberating. It was great.
It's really interesting to me because I went to Wellesley Women's College and we didn't read Woolf. I was an English major at Wellesley, and for my understanding, the lore, haven't done the history of this, but my understanding is that for years, every first year student entering Wellesley was mailed a copy of A Room of One's Own
Huh.
for a period of time, probably in the 70s, right? And the English department just was done. They were done of all these fresh-eyed women arriving and just wanting to talk about nothing but Virginia Woolf. And I had these very steely, kind of new critical, um, strong intellectual professors, both men and women, who wanted something more hard edged. And the reputation of Woolf as being kind of flowy and soft, I think, had, and the fatigue of having had her, I think I must have just arrived at a moment when she had just been overtaught, which happens to writers. And so I didn't get not one essay, short story, nothing as an English major with a focus on British literature at Wellesley.
That's amazing.
It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. But as a teacher, you realize that there's a certain point after which you cannot teach the same book year after year.
Yes,
So
that's true.
I'm going to go for something else. Okay, so my turn. Tell us how you conceived of this new book. There's so much written about Virginia Woolf. So this is Anne's, the Oxford Handbook of Virginia Woolf, which has 39 essays by scholars plus one by me on Virginia Woolf. And it's very rich and very diverse, and it's also brave of somebody to say there's something new to say about Virginia Woolf. So tell us how you conceived of it and how you chose the subjects and the writers.
So this was a really fun project of several years doing, and these are 39 original essays. Each one is about 20 pages long. So what is it? I've got my copy here. It's over 600 page book. Right? And the Oxford handbooks have a certain shape to them. My goal was, the goal of the handbook is to give readers a really powerful overview of life, career, contexts, and afterlives. So, a little bit of biographical background, a couple essays taking you through major phases of a writer's career, thinking about important historical context during that writer's life, and then what is that writer's influence, right? So there's a handbook for Milton, there's a handbook for Shakespeare. For this, so I had that's the basic skeleton that Oxford gave me. For life, I wanted to start and not do Bloomsbury. For every chapter, let me just say, for every chapter, the most important thing to me was my conviction that Woolf is feminist to her core, that it's not a question up for debate, that she is interested in depicting, celebrating, and fighting for kind of what is going to make women's lives better, right? So not often in the most narrowly defined political sense, but always in everything she writes. She's interested in the struggles of women. So every contributor, I was told, I'm taking it for granted that Woolf is a feminist. If you can't take that for granted in your contribution, you don't belong in this volume, but really, we're not having a chapter on is Woolf a feminist, or we're not having a chapter on like men who were important to Woolf without thinking about how she's transforming them as a feminist, right? So that was one. And then I wanted to, when you play jackstraws and you have all those little plastic things that are built like tools, and you kind of take the bag and shake it up, and then you drop it on the floor and it makes a new pattern. I wanted to make a new pattern with what we thought we knew about Woolf's life. So one really common way to talk about Woolf, say in the afterlife section, which is where your chapter is, Roxana, is to say fiction writers who take Woolf as an influence. But Woolf's influence on contemporary fiction is so varied and various that a chapter that had that as its topic would be a list. And that's not an interesting chapter to read. So I decided to divide Woolf's influence on contemporary fiction on contemporary writing into at least 4 areas. So we have a chapter by the novelist and essayist Stacey Erasmo on Woolf and experimental essays, because Woolf's experiments in the essay form have continued to be incredibly powerful, influential on a lot of essayists, from Rebecca Solnit to Stacey Erasmo herself to other writers. I'm trying to think. Her name just Eulabis. There are other, and more. And then Roxana, your chapter on kind of Woolf and the modern novel of manners. So kind of coming out of the tradition of Jane Austen through Woolf to your work, Zadie Smith's work, Michael Cunningham's work. Then Woolf and the feminist novel. What is Woolf's? I mean, after all, the heroine of the Golden Notebook is named Anna Woolf, and that's not on accident, right? I mean, it's spelled a different way, but Lessing is incredibly influenced by Woolf, and there are subsequent feminist novelists who've been powerfully influenced by Woolf. And then Woolf and the magic realist tradition. And so dividing it out by 4 really staked a bigger claim for Woolf's ongoing influence. And then I have a chapter by my friend Laura Smith, who's a curator and art historian, on Woolf's influence on the nonverbal arts, which is really fun. And so, you think about that dance that I never did get to see that was in London a few years back. And some really, really beautiful paintings and sculptures that take you beyond the really wonderful British postmodernist world that Woolf was working in, into abstractions where you might never perceive a Woolfian influence. But the artist statement says, this sculpture of a wire outline of a single bed is my commentary on a room of one's own. Oh, so Laura knows all that stuff, and she was able to bring that in. So I also really, really wanted, so in the chapter in the section on context, I subdivided that as well, and spent quite a bit of time on formal experimentation. Because when scholars and critics talk about stream of consciousness, they tend to do the thing that we've already talked about, right? They tend to say, well, Woolf did it, but Stein and Joyce are more experimental. And so there's some kind of way in which they win, right? And so I wanted to kind of divide out the range, breadth, and depths of Woolf's formal experiments to allow the contributors in the volume to outline the power of what she was trying to do. And I mean, I think for me as a critic, the description of just like what was she up to is such a powerful tool, because it's not so much about, I love Joyce. I think he's a great writer. I'm not particularly interested in these competitions. I don't want Woolf to always lose by default because people don't have the information, right?
So it's a wonderful, huge project, and we're all the better for it. When you talk about Woolf's influence on nonverbal, non-literary creativity, when I teach at Hunter, I teach to the Lighthouse, and I ask my students have to write 2 essays, and one is short and one is long, and one must be a conventional essay. One can be creative, and creative is defined in different ways. And often my students write, some of them are fiction writers or poets, and they often will write a short story or a coda to a work that it has to be related to the works that we have read. And so one year, a student wrote this wonderful short story that was based on the nephew of Lily Briscoe, who took that painting that was left under the bed at Talent House. And by then it's her nephew, so it's several decades later, and the work is sold at Christie's at auction. and it's
Remarkable.
very valuable by now. So it's this wonderful telescoping of time and artistic creativity. And as we know, Woolf loved comparing and kind of marrying the two enterprises, writing and painting. And she did that a lot. She considered the two compared to each other and twinned with each other because of her sister Vanessa. And so she was watching what Vanessa painted and what Vanessa's life was like as a woman artist. And was she successful? Was she blocked by men? Was she blocked by her husband, by her lover, her children? What did it mean to paint something? And what was Woolf doing by writing about something? And they often were writing and working in the same field, trying to set down an experience. So I loved this story, which again twinned the activities of writing and painting. And there's one quote in To the Lighthouse. And one time when I was moving, I wanted to use that quote in an essay I was writing, and I emailed Anne and I said, where does this sentence appear? It's just like that postcard that she sent to her nephew saying, where does this quote from the poet appear? And what's the right quote? I wrote to Anne and said, where does this come from? And she said, this was sort of before Google or something, but she said, it's in To the Lighthouse. But Virginia Woolf writes this wonderful, wonderful sentence about how being an artist is like walking on a single plank out over the water. And you never know until your foot hits the plank, whether the plank is going to be there to receive your weight. It's better than that, but that's the idea. That's the image. And that is exactly what it's like to be a writer, as Woolf knows. So she twins these activities, these creative activities of writing and painting, so that we can feel the interconnection of the two of them. I love that part of Woolf that she allows us to enter into. And I'm so, because I'm more interested in art than I am, or I respond more to art than I am to music, that I do to music. I'm very glad that Vanessa was not a musician, that she was an artist instead, so that we got Woolf's views of art rather than music, which would have been more difficult for me.
What do you think for you? I mean, you've written on George O'Keeffe. In Cost, the protagonist is a painter. For you as a writer, what are the places where the creative process, the project of making something out of nothing with words or with images is similar? And where do you think, oh, she has a tool that I don't have, and I have a tool that she doesn't have, right? So how do you think about how painting and art are alike, and painting and writing are alike, and how do you think about the differences between the media?
That's a really good question. For me, writing, setting words down is the only way to convey an experience. I like to draw, I like to do watercolors, but it's not a way in which I could convey the strength or the importance of an experience. All I could do is record an image, but I can't convey how I feel about it or how powerful it is, and I can't put it in context. And I know that's what an artist does. So they're creating something much larger than a simple image. That's all I could do as an artist. But in writing, I feel that I enter into the world. I enter into the whole universe. I have the universe at my disposal. I can describe anything, and I do it the way we all know that Mrs. Ramsay does it, by sinking deep into the silence of her interior, into that wedge-shaped space of the
That wedge-shaped core of darkness.
Exactly. You've memorized it too. Um, so it's that place that we all enter into if we're artists or writers. As you know, once you get into that silent core of yourself, that's what you need to draw on to express whatever it is you need to express.
So I find it so interesting. And Wolf loved music as well, and doesn't write nearly as much about music as she does about painting. But in her first novel, The Voyage Out, Rachel Vinrace is very, very shy, not very articulate, young woman. And she's on her father's boat. Her father's a captain of a cargo ship, and they're going to South America. And she's playing late Beethoven piano sonatas. And I just thought, I mean, I don't know that much about music. Some of you will be appalled at my ignorance when I say this, but I didn't think much about it. I thought, oh, classical music, she's a good girl and she's playing classical music. Then I'm like, wait, I actually don't know what these sound like. I should listen to them. So I got some recordings and made a Spotify playlist and put it on while I was prepping for class. Well, you can't prep for class. Well, you've got late Beethoven piano sonatas on. They are a journey. Tempo changes, volume changes, absolutely virtuosic. Every single key of the keyboard being used. It is not background music at all. And so now when I teach the Voyage Out, I play one of them for my students because Woolf was very, very deliberately saying, this is a passionate person, beware, right? There's so much more to Rachel than you think. And you can say, as people do say about her in rather, conventional middle class ways, oh, she plays the piano very well, right? And you imagine, someone playing a few ballads and a little Beethoven. That's lovely, dear, that you have some Beethoven in your repertoire. Very deliberately chosen pieces, and that's always when Woolf names something, when Woolf names an exact play, an exact poem, it always profits to go look at that and think, why is it that Septimus loses his interest in Shakespeare around Antony and Cleopatra? Well, gee, a shell-shocked soldier who thinks about what happens to Mark Antony is not going to be able to believe wartime propaganda that you're going to be a hero, right? I mean, Mark Antony has a really the part of the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra is that he's not afforded a hero's tragic death, right? He has a kind of humiliating tragic death. And so when Septimus goes sour on Shakespeare, of course it's with Antony and Cleopatra. It's exactly the right play.
So that leads us to my favorite question. And I think this is so much fun for me, and I think it's probably fun for all Woolf fans. Anne is an extraordinary scholar, very, very conscientious and fabulously inventive. So this is a question that I've asked you before because I love the answer. So tell about The Veil Upon the Rock.
So this I love this story too. So in Mrs. Dalloway, there's a moment when Septimus Warren Smith, who's a shell-shocked World War I veteran, is having his most damaged thoughts, his most intense hallucinations. And he says, he felt macerated like a veil on a rock. And I was writing the footnotes to Mrs. Dalloway for the Cambridge edition. I need to footnote every literary allusion. A veil, like what you would wear over your face, like a wedding veil on a rock, that's really weird. That must be an allusion to something, right? And so what is it an allusion to? So I'm like, well, who's on a rock in Greek mythology? So Prometheus. Well, Woolf loved Shelley, Prometheus Unbound. I really don't, I'm not a big Shelley fan, so I'm rereading Prometheus Unbound, getting nothing, 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 nothing. Nothing's coming to me. I'm thinking about rocks and veils. I'm reading Prometheus in translation. And then one night, separately from this, my children were quite little, and I was reading my father's copy of the Children's Homer, which was translated into prose for children in the 30s. So it's actually something that would have been around in Woolf's day. It was just my dad's childhood book. And I'm reading it, and we get to the scene where Odysseus's men have all died. He's been shipwrecked. Poseidon is angry at him, and he's clinging to a mast, the only wooden board left. And then Poseidon says, "That's too much comfort for you." And he takes the mast away, and Odysseus is naked, just floating in the Mediterranean. And the goddess Ino gives him a veil and says, "Here, take this veil, imperishable. It will save you." And he puts the veil on and kind of body surfs onto Nausicaa's island and is completely cut up from the rocks as he body surfs onto those islands and faints. And Nausicaa finds him and says, "Oh, he's so beautiful," and saves him. And then they put him in the boat on his way home to Ithaca. So I was like, oh, it's Homer. Then how, but I think it might be Homer, but I'm reading the children's Homer, right? This is not what Woolf was reading. So then I go and I start reading, and I go to Woolf's diary. Woolf kept a diary. She kept reading notebooks. She kept composition notebooks for her fiction and notebooks for her nonfiction. She would bind her own handmade books, marble the paper herself, and bind these books. And she dated everything that she wrote. And so I could go to the manuscript of Mrs. Dalloway and find the day that she wrote that sentence, his body was macerated like a veil on a rock, and then go to the other notebooks, her essay notebooks, and see what was she writing. Well, she was writing her essay on not knowing Greek. Okay, well, let me look at her diary. Does she talk about what she's reading? And she says, I'm rereading Homer. I don't like it, but I got up to book 5, which is where Odysseus goes to Nausicaa's island. So on that day, on the day that she wrote that sentence, she read that book of Homer. And then I can go online to Washington State University, which has the catalog of all the books that survived the Blitz from Leonard and Virginia Woolf's personal library, and see which translations of Homer did they have in their personal library. And they had at least 3. I mean, a lot of their books were destroyed in the Blitz, but they had at least 3 that survived in their summer house. And so I could look online at those translations and see that 2 of the 3 translations did use the word veil for the piece of fabric that the goddess Ino gave them. So that was like one of the most exciting discoveries. It's really fun to discover an illusion. I'm the person who discovered it. I'm super proud. But more than that, it's amazing because it means that Septimus is Odysseus. So if Septimus is Odysseus, if Septimus is like Odysseus, Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey is a soldier desperately trying for years and years and years to get home. And some contemporary scholars of Homer say all those adventures, right? We only have Odysseus's word for everything that happened to him, right? It's all told in retrospect, right? All the other men have died by the time he gets to tell his story. And some psychological critics say one way to read the Odyssey is that it's a narrative of a traumatized soldier, right? So there's this adventure to the Odyssey, but there's also this real sadness, how hard it is to come home from war and return to your family. And that's the journey that Septimus is on in Mrs. Dalloway. He's trying to get his mind back for himself. And so buried deep in the book, this is such a funny Woolfian thing to do, to say, all right, James Joyce, I see you, right? That was cute what you did, very clever. Let me talk to you about the psychic weight of what it means to be broken by war and struggling to come back to yourself. It's amazing.
It's brilliant. It's a wonderful scholar's journey that you've taken us on. So I love that story, and I love the way it comes out with Woolf able to evoke a world that's even. This is not a competition. Joyce is a great writer, but still, I love that idea that this is a weightier project even than.
I mean, the greatness of Ulysses challenged her to try something. I mean, that's the best kind of competition, right? I mean, I think that's the way I'd like to say it, is the greatness of that book challenged her to think about, how could I do a novel that's a single day novel? Like, let me try that. That's really, it's an interesting project, right? Single day novels are really interesting.
Yeah, which it's a great project. And also she does it, and she says, now Joyce has done it with a sort of a man who's on the streets and leads a life that's not elegant, that's kind of the people. And she chooses the opposite. She chooses a woman who is whose marriage has sort of lapsed. She's sort of virginal. She's upper middle class. So it's the opposite of what the world of literature was asking for at that time. She says, I'm going to give you the exact opposite and see if I can make a great novel out of this notion, which is the opposite of what you've done. And it's a wonderfully brave, courageous response on her part.
And I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that Woolf was like Clarissa Dalloway, and I don't think Woolf's like Clarissa Dalloway at all. I think Woolf is, as you say, Roxana, setting herself a project of, let me pick a kind of woman whom you're likely to dismiss.
Exactly.
and let me show you how deep, interesting, profound she is.
And can you write a novel about a party?
Right.
Yeah,
That's right.
which is a radical suggestion. So all of Woolf's ideas are radical, although they are presented. I mean, one of the radical aspects of them is that they are presented in a way that makes you think they're not radical. So a novel about a society woman having a party is not a radical idea, but she's saying even this can be great. A woman's life can be as great as a man's, even if she is not a warrior.
Right. A large family on a summer vacation.
Right.
Doesn't sound very promising, right? Or it doesn't sound like it's going to break barriers, right? Oh,
Right.
large family on summer vacation. We've seen that before. But
I
To the
know.
Lighthouse is not just a large family on a summer vacation.
No, it's very radical. Okay, so there's another thing. It's in preparation for this. I've been reading all sorts of bits of Woolf, but one thing that interests me is in the book On Being Ill, um, Virginia Woolf, who often experienced illness and sometimes very serious illness, and because she's a writer, she responds to these experiences, and she says that it's odd that since being ill is such a radically transformative experience, that you think you're going to die when you have a cold, and the whole world has changed when you feel bad. She said it's amazing, since it is such a powerful experience, that writers don't write about it. She said, but you've never heard of a novel about a fever. You've never heard of a novel about coming back to consciousness after a tooth being pulled out. And she sort of mocks these ideas, and yet she says it's very, very powerful. And then she says, this is a quote: writers pretend that the body is a pane of glass through which the mind can be perfectly seen. But in fact, the body is demanding, obstructive, and powerful, and influences every second of our lives. And I think it's a really interesting subject. And the body, if we look at Pilgrim's Progress as sort of the origin of the novel in the West, it was a spiritual journey, and it's a pilgrim who's moving towards the light, and he's giving up the life of the body. And so that's the way we expect novelists to write. But Virginia Woolf is saying the life of the body is really, really important. And yet she also said somewhere that she herself could never write about sex. She couldn't write about that kind of erotic experience because she was embarrassed at the idea that people would read it and think of her, and they would twin this description of an experience with the woman herself, and she never wanted that to happen. So I think this notion of kind of a Puritan privacy and a resistance to the idea of the body, whereas she was writing about every other kind of physical experience. She writes about the smells of the summer and the sun on your face and everything else, but she doesn't write about this body. Do you want to talk about that at all, Anne?
I think that for Woolf, the way that she writes about sexuality and sex is displaced. So you think about the scene in Mrs. Dalloway where Clarissa thinks about the kiss from Sally Seton. And, that is the most precious memory, the greatest thing that's ever happened to her in her life. And at the moment that Clarissa's being kissed, she thinks, I want to save this and think about it some other day. So there's a kind of dissociation, right? This is not someone who's present in the moment she's being kissed. This is someone who's imagining thinking about it later. And then when she does think about it later, there's this incredibly erotic passage about the match in the crocus that's really very influenced by Walter Pater. And it's a really erotic sexual passage that doesn't have human bodies in it, right?
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting to me, and it's interesting to me as a index of what an upper middle class woman whose sexuality was very complicated. She was married to a man her whole life. She had a love affair with a woman in the middle of that marriage. Her marriage survived her love affair with Vita Sackville West. That was a sexual affair, but her most important relationships were almost entirely with women. Leonard said in the 70s, "Oh, my wife was a lesbian." I think labels are tricky and odious, right? But certainly Woolf was not a woman with a simple sexuality. And then, given her upbringing, I think it's easier just to talk about the erotic life of plants than it is to say, this is what it felt like when she touched my leg. This is, but you have, when you're speaking of touching my leg, that beautiful passage in To the Lighthouse where Lily is leaning on Mrs. Ramsay and there's a fur hem that she's kind of stroking. And that's not subtle. So we look for it in different ways. And I think if we look for it in different ways, we find something that for me sometimes is richer than just a description of an act.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, as with everything else with Woolf, it is very richly layered and complicated, and that makes it a wonderful experience to read.
Can you talk a little bit about more directly about why Woolf, and maybe Michael Cunningham's The Hours, but Woolf especially, since that's who we're here to talk about, how she influences you, how you think about her influence on your work, how you try not to think about her influence on your work, what for you as a creative person do you take from Woolf, and maybe what lessons do you think Woolf has for writers today? When you teach Woolf, if you teach a Woolf novel in your MFA classes, what are you thinking? This is what I think Woolf can give you that other fiction writers may not give you as much of or as directly.
So there isn't a simple or single answer to that, but there's several things that are essential to me and to many fiction writers. And one is she says somewhere, everything is metaphor. And that is the way she sees the world. And it is unbelievably beautiful. So that every sentence that she sets down is a kind of double description of somebody. So-and-so is, so-and-so came to tea, she's meek now, and she has the eyes of a sheep. So you get that you understand that she's responding to her personality, but she's also giving you an image. Well, that's not a metaphor, but she deals in different kinds of perception. And so the metaphor is always very powerful. To the Lighthouse is given that title. It's incredibly powerful as a symbol. But it's also a real lighthouse that she could see from her bedroom. So she is always dealing on two levels, and that is very, very powerful for fiction writers. So that everything you describe carries two layers. If you use one word to describe green, it's going to have another. If it's olive green, you're telling me something about the way you feel about that green. If it's hunter green, it's a different color. So she makes you alive to the different levels of perception that she's producing. She also gives me this sense of shimmering consciousness that really no one else for me produces, this sense of awareness, an awareness that's made up of a million tiny glittering fragments. And that's the way she encounters the world, so that she describes London in June. It's fresh. It's full of the young girls cantering on their ponies in the mall, and it's full of. No, it's not the young girls on the ponies, but it's the riders of the ponies, and the young girls are coming back from the debutante parties, and there's this sense of incredible bounty that she finds in the material world, and so everything that she describes is filled with awareness of every single aspect of the life. And she does it in a way, it's the opposite of Raymond Carver, somebody, or
Okay.
Hemingway, who wants to strip down each sentence so that it's a sentence that can be, it's facts. It's just full of facts. And what Woolf does is full of awareness and a kind of this shimmering quality in the air. It's full of alternatives, and so what she does is give you a way to see the world that really, for me, no one else equals. So this sense of awareness of a space, awareness of psychological reality. So in the opening of To the Lighthouse, you see Mrs. Ramsay and James and Mr. Ramsay approaching them as a dangerous intruder. She creates the psychological world so powerfully. And James,
Had there been an axe handy or a red hot
yes,
poker. I mean,
yes,
what a
hello.
thought for a 6-year-old boy to have about his dad. But he's angry. And just like James was angry at his father, he was jealous that he came in. It's just, had there been an axe handy, and just like a fragment of a phrase. And had there been an axe handy, oh, here comes your father. Had there been an axe handy? He's 6.
He's 6.
He's 6. He's cutting out a picture of a refrigerator from a catalog, doing that thing. I don't think anyone younger than me remembers that project, but that was a project my mom used to set me to. Give me a notebook and a magazine, and you cut pictures out of the magazine and glue them into the notebook so you make a new magazine. It's such a funny project. But and I would do that, and we would bring them to the hospital for sick children. I would go through Ladies Home Journal and Red Book and all the magazines and cut out all the kitties and puppies and put them in, and then that would be something for a convalescing child at the hospital. So James is doing that kind of project, right? It's just the kind of strange, tender, charming, busy work we give to people who are just about to learn how to read, where we just like, you need to learn how to use a scissor, you need to learn how to use glue. And so we're going to give you this little thing. And you're right. I mean, everyone scrapbooks now, but so maybe it's just a super familiar thing that's persisted under a different name. I think that's right.
But also so everything you say is right. And she's giving him, it's not just busy work. Well, it is busy work. I mean, she wants him to stay occupied while she is knitting, but they're also having this conversation about whether or not they can go to the lighthouse. And then when finally he's allowed to think that they might go, the refrigerator, I think it's the refrigerator, or maybe he's moved on now to the, what is it, a harvest
threshing machine or something.
threshing
So
machine.
why don't you cut this out? Because it's really prickly. It's
But
difficult.
anyway, so as he cuts it, it is frilled with joy. So she moves in this metaphorical space where he's actually cutting out an object. You are seeing the object in your mind, and then we hear that it's physically frilled with an abstract emotion. That's what she does, moves between it so easily and so beautifully between the world of abstraction and the world of reality.
I was listening to an interview last week with someone. I wish I could remember because it's really stuck with me, this comment. And the interviewee was observing that the amount, I don't know if this is true, I'm not a scientist, the amount of matter in the universe is fixed, right? We can't create new matter. But one of the things that's so thrilling about metaphor, this was a leap, I didn't expect this, is that because it means two things at once, it's almost like it creates a double thing, right? And I think years and years ago, A.S. Byatt wrote a piece in the TLS that makes a similar observation that says the pleasure of metaphysical poetry is so intense because every thought lights up a neuron in our brain. And when you get a pun, or when you understand the both meanings in a metaphor, you literally have two neurons firing at once. So it's like there's a physiological charge in your brain that's double when you figure something out. And that's part of the pleasure of recognizing a literary illusion, right? You get a little jolt, and it's a literal jolt. And it's also like, I like that idea, and I like that idea of creating something new. And so what you're talking about with my students sometimes will say, well, green is a color of spring. I'm like, no, green is not a color of spring. Like, green has no meaning. you have to give it a meaning, right? Because if you say olive green, that doesn't even have a meaning. But in a sentence about soldiers, if something's olive green, then the color of soldiers' uniforms and the word olive are kind of starting to intersect with each other, and you can start to build a connotation for that word. But that's your job as a writer, right? That's not inherent in red is neither murder nor love, right? It depends on the sentence you put that word red in.
Yeah, and she elevates every sentence so that it is filled with these moments of double understanding, which are thrilling and exciting, and it allows us to feel more alive. It makes you feel as though you are experiencing the world in a new way, because she's giving you these two layers for everything. So are we?
We
What
should
should we do?
probably move
Should we
to
look at
the questions. And I see
Right.
one. Sorry, Roxana, was that what you were going to
Oh,
say?
yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
Sorry, forgive me.
Yeah.
So there are a couple in the chat that I can see about Woolf's death and about the mistreatment that she had by her doctors, right? Um, so if you go to the, let's start with the doctors first. The treatment for depression, as many of you probably know, Woolf never had a diagnosis. She made her first suicide attempt at age 13 at the death of her mother. She never had a diagnosis, but a lot of people make a posthumous diagnosis of manic depression, which seems to fit with her experiences. So I'm not disputing that, but I just want to be very clear that that wasn't an available diagnosis in her lifetime, and it wasn't a diagnosis that anyone made. That's a posthumous diagnosis. That's a very, very different thing. The treatment for the symptoms that Woolf had was overfeeding, isolation, no reading, no writing. Very, very challenging treatment for Virginia Woolf. No, don't talk about it, don't think about it, don't write about it, and don't read anything else. And have a lot of milk and butter.
Milk. Yeah, a lot of milk.
A lot of milk. Leonard, for her entire life, brought her a glass of whole milk at 11 every day. So the doctors in Mrs. Dalloway are based on doctors whom Woolf saw. And one of the most poignant and powerful moments in Mrs. Dalloway is when Clarissa thinks you would, upon seeing Sir William Bradshaw, no one would like him to see you ill. What a thing to say about a doctor, right? But she just has a visceral, immediate response that this is not a man around whom it's safe to be vulnerable. And that's true for Septimus, right? I mean, that ends up being true because he just immediately orders Septimus into a nursing home, which is the kind of not the immediate cause, but kind of the cause before the cause of his jump. So I guess, yeah. So I talked myself into a dead end. So that there we go. Let me stop there before I get. So it's very, very well. The treatment for, I think, cream and butter really slow you down. I mean, they're very uh, calming, right? I don't know why. That's what they thought. The talking cure, Woolf's brother was an analyst, Freudian trained by Freud. The Hogarth Press was the first English publisher of Freud. Woolf met Freud in 1941. So, and in England, the psychiatrist W.H.R. Rivers was pioneering a kind of Freudian adjacent kind of talk therapy during World War I. And he is the subject in, oh, why did it go right out of my head? Those novels about Owen and Brooke. that the British woman wrote. It's a trilogy, World War I trilogy. Regeneration. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Pat Barker. Thank you so much. It just left me. Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. The doctor in there is
Yeah.
based on rivers, but that treatment, which was just beginning in 1917, was not at all widely available. And the treatment that Septimus receives was the mainstream top flight treatment for mental illness, and the treatment for shell shock and for what was then called hysteria were identical for many years, right? And Susan Gubar and Sandra Gilbert have written about that in their work on World War One. Woolf's suicide itself came at age 59 during the Blitz, 1941, the winter of 1941, before the United States entered the war, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? So this was in March of 1941 that she killed herself. And she was starting to hallucinate again, which was a sign of a kind of psychotic break. She hadn't had one for many, many years. She made several suicide attempts and survived them, at 13 and again at 30. And she started hearing voices, was worried about money. Her home in London had been bombed. It looked like Hitler was winning. She was known to be a leftist lesbian married to a Jew, and she feared accurately that she was on the list, the Nazis' list of people to round up immediately upon a German invasion of England. And she was frantic not to be a burden to her family in the way that depressed people get really, really worried about that their illness is going to make them a financial burden or some other kind of burden. And Leonard and Virginia had cyanide in case of Nazi invasion of England, and they were, when their house in London was bombed, they were displaced to Sussex on the southern coast of England, and was in the flight path of the German planes going to bomb London. And so their country house was absolutely no escape from what was happening in their town. And she felt this seems increasingly strange to me as I am in my 50s now, but at 59 she felt quite elderly. And she really was worried about being a burden. So I think the whole context of what was going on politically, psychologically, financially, and in terms of the war contributed to her choosing to end her life at that time.
So we are coming to the end of our time here. Are there any other comments or anything that either Roxana or Anne would like to end with?
It's such a rich conversation, and we could go on talking for the rest of the day, I think, on this.
It was fantastic. It was so fascinating and insightful. I'm very grateful for your time. I'm sure all of the people who attended are equally grateful, and I can just thank you very much for turning this into a wonderful afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Roxana. It's always, I wish we were in the same room, but it's always fun to talk about Woolf with you. And I hope that it was a nice respite for those of you who tuned in.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.